We have been waiting to produce this festival for 6 years. When we left this building in 2006, this is the work that we were producing, and we've been wanting to do this work ever since. We are thrilled to welcome incredible leaders, activists, and artists on stage here tonight. I would now like to welcome to the stage members of the Civilians, the Obie Award-winning investigative theater company based in New York. Erika Rose, Jordan Mahome, Dan Domingues, and Matt Dellapina will perform excerpts from an ongoing project of the Civilians, who have been conducting interviews with members of the Occupy movement over the past year and have created an online open-source interview project called Occupy Your Mind, all of which will culminate in performances nationwide and in NYC at Joe's Pub on September 17th. Please welcome the Civilians.
I came down to Zuccotti the first day, and I came with my best friend, and we ended up staying the night, and then we didn't leave for like 2-something weeks. I got involved in the Direct Action Working Group, which was this kind of hodgepodge of really devout, like, self-identifying anarchists. And for me, I don't identify as anything. I don't really care. I just kind of go with what I think is right at the time. And so anyways, we became a very tight crew. So we had a meeting at my friend Ashley's house, about 30 people who were involved in kind of carrying out the tactical plan. And while we were still there, some cops had come to the apartment and were like, "What's going on in here?" And we were like, "None of your fucking business." So, like, that was weird. But that same night, I take 3 or 4 of the guys, they've been staying at my house, and we go to my space. And I realize, one of them had used all my roommate's instant coffee. And I was like, oh, shit, I gotta replace it. She's gonna be pissed. So I go down to the bodega. But immediately, I come outside, and there's like 2 cops outside my door. And I immediately close the door behind me because I don't want them to go into my building. And I'm just like, "Look, what's up?" And they're like, "Yeah, we need to get into the building." And I was like, "Well, you can call the supervisor. What do you need to get into the building for?" And they wanted to do a security check. I was like, "Oh, well, you know, call the supervisor. I'm not letting you in." So I go to the store, get the coffee, and I come out. And this was like my regular bodega on the corner. I come out, and there's a police van, like suddenly right there. And I mean, like, that's not abnormal. I mean, for a police van, it is. Normally there's like a cruiser that sometimes parks there, sometimes parks the next one up, but the van was a little unusual. And as I'm walking back, it's following me. As I'm walking down like 2 blocks, and I'm just like staring at the 2 cops that are still outside my front door, as this police van is obviously following me. And I just look at them. I was like, "What's up, guys? Are you following me?" And they're like, not even looking at me, you know, like kind of turn away. So I arrive at the 2 cops, and the police van like pulls away, turns around the corner, and I'm kind of stuck in this dilemma because I know if I open the door, they're gonna enter my building. And there's only 4 units in my apartment, all rented out by women, 1 an elderly woman. So I was really concerned. And 1, is there like something happening in the building? Like, is someone having a problem? And they're like, no, you know, it's not your business. This is a security check. And I'm like, I know, but there's like 4 women in this building, this apartment building. Is there like a situation happening? Like that if I go upstairs, is there like a robber, like a rapist? Like, give me a hint, you're supposed to be the fucking cops. And they're just completely not cooperating with me, answering any of my questions. And I was like, okay. And then like right up on me, like one of them is really tall, like a very fat kind of like, and I'm starting to get nervous because 1, I can't go back in. Like, I'm on the street, and these 2 cops are like starting to give me shit about not opening the door. And I'm like, I'm not opening the door. So, you know, we kind of go back and forth, and I was like, look, you know, earlier this year, 2 cops repeatedly raped a woman. You know, like, I don't feel comfortable with 2 male cops standing in front of me and trying to enter into my building. And I'd appreciate it if you would back the fuck up so I can enter my apartment. So eventually it gets into this kind of like screaming match, and they back off a little bit because I'm like really uncomfortable at this point. And I don't have my phone. The guys are upstairs, and I was like, okay. I was like, okay, so I'm gonna enter my building, and you guys are gonna stay here, right? And they're like, yes, we'll stay on the sidewalk. We'll call the supervisor. Cool. So I go to the door, and I open the door, and I turn around to close it, and immediately the big fat cop just like shoves his foot, pushes himself in. So it's just me and this big fat cop in between the front door and like the second door, and I'm just like, okay, well, I'm not, like, we're just gonna stand here. Like, at this point, it's like, I'm just gonna stand here, you know? And luckily the super was walking his dog. And I see him and I'm like, hey, you need to come and deal with this because I'm not letting these people in. And so the cops come, I was like, that's the super right there. These cops are trying to enter your building. And they're not even, you know, like asking permission. So can you deal with this? And he starts kind of bickering with them. And I like sneak in and I close the door and I go upstairs. A lot of my friends have had incidences of, there's been incidences of infiltration into the groups. My cousin, who's an assistant district attorney in the Bronx, had never come down to the park. And when he came, he like on a whim, you know, had a morning off. He comes down and he wants to have coffee. And we're standing by like this telephone booth on Liberty. And he hasn't really gone through the park at this point. He just kind of gotten there. And I was like, okay, I'll give you a little tour. And we start to like walk in. And at the top of the steps, he's like, oh shit, I have to go. And I was like, what? And he's like, I have to go. He was like, there are undercover cops right now, cops that I know in that park, waving, holding signs. And he didn't like point them out, but he was like, he just bounced. He just like booked it because he was like terrified that he was gonna lose his job, or he was gonna be reprimanded, or that he was gonna have to blow somebody's cover, and then he gets in serious trouble. So I was like, whoa, fuck! No, like, what do you mean? Like, who? Tell me! And he's like, no, I gotta go! But, fuck, yeah, so, yeah, I know for a fact that they were down there.
I'm from Philadelphia. Now, this is my first time ever in New York City. My first time in this great big city that I call Babylon. I call it Babylon. You know, we've been playing chess for about an hour now and talking about everything about physics to God and energy and planets and microscopes. Interesting stuff. Not for the faint of heart. This is my sport. I love it. A lot of people don't consider chess a sport, but it's physical. It's physical. No, okay, it's a mental thing. You know, a sport doesn't have to be physical, where you sweat. The mind can also sweat. I was serving rice. I worked in the kitchen right there. We had a kitchen in the middle. It was 1 in the morning. It was like a surprise raid. They just came. Thousands of them. Well, not thousands, but hundreds. Hundreds of cops swarmed the whole place. They put up floodlights, and they were speaking something that could not even be interpreted. But people didn't know if people were getting arrested, or if you leave, they're going to arrest you, or what was going on. So a lot of people just stayed because of fear. They started taking all the stuff, throwing it away, you know. Everyone that stayed sat down, cross-legged, a human chain, and locked arms. That's it. That's it. No one threw any punch. No one stood up. But yet they came. They kicked, they punched, they drug us. Peaceful people. It was the most... I lost a lot of faith that day in this country, or government, or police. And look, we came here to express freedom of speech that we're supposed to have. You know, it breaks my heart to be an American. I love this country, you know, but now I have no faith in my government. Before here, I had two companies. I had a moving company and I had a home remodeling company. I was doing really well for myself, but others around me were suffering. My workers had to suffer. In home remodeling, people started using cheap labor, the Mexicans, people they got willing to work for $15 a day. So me, as an honest man that was trying to work, make an honest living, you know, pay my workers a worthy wage, in order for me to compete, I had to pay my workers like shit. Otherwise, I could not go and bid on a job properly, you know? I'd lose the contract. It's crazy, you know? I didn't want to be a part of that anymore, so that's why I came. I have a 3-month-old son at home right now. I left him to be here because I fear for his future. That and many other reasons, you know. Yeah, I miss him every day. I miss him very much. I love him. But I could do anything for him in life. I could buy him things, but what can I do but fight for his future by being here, you know, trying to change this world, you know, at least if I tried. I seen a man right here in the park. I seen a man had a house for 20 years. Right here in this park, he had a house for 20 years, a family. One day he lost his job. He couldn't pay his mortgage anymore. And the sheriff's department, hundreds of them, not hundreds of them, but about 20 of them, bankers came, knocked on his door, told him and his family they had to get out. Now they sleep in a van, him and his family. He said it broke him, broke his heart, broke his soul. So, and it touches you, you know, it really touches you. It makes me not want to be a part of this world. There's another world just outside of here where people go on about their daily lives because they're not affected. It makes me want to stay right here because this is where it's real. Believe it or not, this is real. This is reality. Outside of there isn't reality. They live in a fantasy world until one day we see we're affected too. And from here, this reality, we have to change it.
We're both medics here. Been here 21 days. 21 days today.
Yeah. I'm Chris.
I'm Lily. We have a lot of people who are living here, so it's pretty much like most of the time we're playing like mom or a school nurse for the most part, but yeah, we're playing mom.
Yeah. I'm great at playing mom.
But sometimes, I mean, we definitely had a lot more injuries from police brutality. We've been dealing with a lot of pepper spray because people have been getting sprayed a lot. The one video of those two girls getting pepper sprayed, there's probably been like 5 times that amount. They're getting a little wild with their batons. Like the other night, there was a group of kids who were kind of trying to initiate a riot. And we're not about that at all. We're a very, very peaceful group. But they were pushing over barriers and stuff, so, I mean, those kids had what was coming to them, but we treated 3 different girls who just happened to be near them who got pepper sprayed.
Yeah, we have this mixture made of half Malox, half water that you squirt in the eyes, you know, it acts as a base and it clears out all the toxins and the peppers.
It's so funny, it looks like milk. It looks like we're squirting milk into their faces.
Yeah, sometimes I want to put it in my cereal.
The other day, a kid who got hit in the shin with a baton just split his shin open with the baton. He was like a tiny, tiny guy.
We also have a lot of handcuff injuries, you know, people who get nerve damage.
Other than that, we've been dealing with a lot of mental illness too. I mean, everything is free, so we're a huge kind of where all the homeless people tend to be flocking as well. Mm-hmm. And when I say mental illness, that's in a very broad scheme of things. The people who treat this as like a full-time job and maybe get 2 to 3 hours of sleep and that have been doing this since like day one, so 21 days now, are really starting to like, they're starting to lose it a little bit. just getting so stressed out and tired. And we try to help by like taking them. I live in Brooklyn, so I bring people to my house to sleep, get rested, shower and stuff. A lot of people do that around here.
There was one kid, like you said, it's a community, and this one kid I was talking to a few days ago who was here 5 days prior to that, and I love that he said it in this way. I go, how long you been here? And he says, oh, I moved in here 5 days ago.
So many people around here bought one-way tickets, one-way plane tickets from California and Oregon and Washington. They're like, yep, that's where I'm living now. I quit my job and now I'm here. I just happened to be moving again, and it was going to be Austin, Texas, or Brooklyn, and I was like, well, I'll be moving to Brooklyn. I'm moving to Brooklyn, so then I'm right there for the occupation. We'll be here however long it takes.
I've got a little medical training background. I'm a firefighter in New Jersey, so that's where my training comes from.
Everyone at the medic station has some form of, I'm an EMT myself.
No, we met here. I didn't really know anyone else here.
And we've made friends here that'll last forever.
Yeah.
Forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, we'll become friends on Facebook.
No, we're not on Facebook. No, I've had one, since 20 days of being here, I've had one friend request on Facebook. I thought that was amazing. Just one, you know, it's great. I haven't been on Facebook in probably like a week and a half. Like, I checked it the other day, and I was like, there's only one friend request. Like, that's awesome. I'm just going to get rid of this thing. 2 days ago, when there was like 30,000 people down here, it was because of all the unions. And yeah, Wednesday, and it was like the walk out of school day. Probably one of the best. All of a sudden, this group of fully suited EMTs and paramedics walked down to the medic station, and they were like, we're here for the whole day to march with you guys. And all of them, I almost started crying. Like, I literally almost started crying, and it was just so relieving because we were so tired and had been through so many people, and they were just there. They were just like, we're here to show our support. Also, Jeff Mangum from Neutral Milk Hotel gave a private concert at 12 o'clock on Tuesday night. Right up there, Tuesday night at like midnight. I cried. Like, there was only probably 100 people because at night it gets like, there's just not that many people. And he just showed up and everyone was like, wait, aren't you? And he was like, yeah, I got my guitar. I want to play you guys a concert. And it was just like, oh, they're my favorite band, like, of all time. There's so many celebrities just walking in and out of here. I'm just too tired. Yeah. It's like
something really cool, actually. Oh, and the union, the TWU union, the Transport Workers Union, is on our side. So the MTA is not going to allow the use of a city bus to arrest us anymore.
It also means that the police in the city, their funds, can't collect overtime. So there's a lot of angry cops that won't get paid overtime. And we drain the city of money for overtime stuff. So they're getting paid a regular wage, hourly wage for overtime.
Toilet, there's a McDonald's.
Yeah, Burger King has locked us out pretty much. Burger King's like, no, you're not allowed in here anymore. But McDonald's, all the employees love us. They're like, they give us stuff and they talk about what's going on. And then O'Hara's, that pub down there, and we use that one instead of having to go to McDonald's all the time.
Well, I like that when Burger King started not serving us, all the union workers working on the World Trade site boycotted Burger King.
I mean, yeah. I mean, like, we are in the walk. I mean, when you go, because they had that big art gallery, that 9/11 Memorial Art Gallery on Wall Street, and from there to there, it's a direct walk. You have to walk through us to get there. So, like, so many foreigners and stuff, they're, like, walking through there, and they're just like, what's going on? And, I mean, nobody's afraid to stop and explain what's going on.
Hey. Oh, yeah, I've been here 24 hours. So, do you want to hear my story? Okay, well, I have been unemployed for about a year and a half now. I then had a major medical situation, and for a 1-month period, maybe out of like 5 months in my entire life when I didn't have health insurance, I shattered my shoulder in 5 places. I spent my 65 grand in savings, and then right afterwards, my mother had a stroke, so I went to Florida, and I took care of her for a few months, came back here, and then sent out thousands of resumes, unemployment, the whole 9 yards. What I do is I'm a creative director for kids television. So a lot of that has migrated to other places where they fund it. If you turn on PBS here, or Nickelodeon, or Cartoon Network, you will see at the end of a lot of these programs, there's a little stamp at the end that says CMF. It's the Canadian Media Fund. So much of kids animation has been leaving the US and going to Canada, going to the Philippines, going to Japan, going to all these different places, because it's not subsidized here. When my company closed, 150 employees were employed there, gone. About half of the animators moved to Canada, well, because they could get work there. Well, and it's really kind of sad because the most precious commodity we have as a country is our children's minds, and if we're not able to custom cater to that in our own country, then I don't know, that just doesn't speak very highly of us as a country. For me, the tipping point was financial. My situation was so bad and so bleak and so dark that it was like, I am going to have to do something dramatic in the next, 24, 48 hours. I lost my apartment on the Upper East Side. All my stuff is in storage. And so, yeah, I'm just surviving. Underneath me, I've got my computer with all my kid shows on it, all my best stuff on it. Yeah, that and my iPhone. If it wasn't for Steve Jobs, God rest his soul, I don't know what kind of activity I'd have in the world right now. Exactly, yeah, we hold on to the few precious things that are really valuable, like our Apple tech. We have our priorities. Once you lose your Apple tech, then you are at a whole new level that you have to recover from. You can be homeless and hungry, but if you are homeless and hungry without your Apple tech, then you are really screwed. I've spoken with other people in the industry who are here and are basically like, yeah, I'm here. I'm about to be homeless. I'm about to be kicked out, and I wanted to come down and support other producers and stuff like that. So it's like, it is unbelievable. It is unreal. And I'm in a very specialized kind of situation, but as the unemployment rate keeps getting larger and larger, and it affects pools that are much larger than the kids' television pool, the consequences are going to be much more dynamic. And we're saying that this is our own milder, tamer Arab Spring, and well, hopefully we can get enough attention slowly, without violence, to get Congress to be not so self-serving. Well, something has got to change in our political system. I'd like it to. I don't know, but I'm holding out hope. I've still got some hope in there. I'm a hopey, changey, feely kind of person. Occupy. It's going to keep going on indefinitely. It's going to keep going indefinitely. I mean, the heart and soul is jobs, the economy. We are the 99%. You are the 1%. That's the main movement. Of course, aside from that movement, you have all kinds of fringe elements of people saying this or that. I mean, all peace movements, though, if you look throughout history, all have a bunch of different messages, but a couple of main core messages. So I think that's the key here. You've got, wingnuts next to, geniuses here. Personal situations they'd pack together like a moth to a flame. I see a lot of young homeless people here. What am I feeling? I'm just feeling shame, disgust, beyond depression, all those things. It's like unbelievable. It is unbelievable. It is unbelievable that I am in the situation I am in, where a year and a half ago, I had an over 6-figure salary job, and I'm a caring, compassionate, tenacious, intelligent person. I've spent my life helping other causes, and to be myself now as the one needing the help, it is really difficult. And the fact that in the last 6 months, my pride has really affected my ability to take help that maybe I should have or could have, asked for, earlier. So it's really bad. And it's hard when a guy, too, I know it sounds stupid because it's tough on anybody, but for some reason, for me, it was really tough, as a guy, because as a guy, you feel like, you know, I'm the provider. I take care of things. In the past, that's what I've done for years. Send money to my family in Florida. You know, my mom's suffering. I had to keep her healthy and all these different things. And so, you know, it's tough. You don't want to get yourself too emotional or upset, because that doesn't it doesn't keep you the ability to plow forward. But at the same time, the more your self-esteem is continually undermined by not having work, the more difficult it is for you to get work. And I never understood that before. I mean, I had an understanding of homeless people. I mean, I've always had massive compassion. I've had homeless people literally live in my house. Yeah, I would have them over for Thanksgiving dinner and feed them and just feed them all. You just never think the circle will come back around to you, you know? Well, what happens is that actually as the pieces just start to fall off the machine of your human life, as you lose your apartment, your stuff goes into storage, or you lose your health insurance, all these pieces start to fall away. It's really tough to reconstitute them. It's tough to, it's like, it's tough to gain the will to fight. I still have fighting spirit, but at times I'm just so low. It's just like, fuck it, you know? And, well, no, I've applied to everything. It's not like I was like, oh, no, I'm only going to take creative director jobs. No, I've applied to, you know, over 40 Walgreens. I've applied to local places. I've done everything. And I'm particularly in a weird spot, you know, being a 40-year-old guy who's a little bit out of that young, eager, new trainee role for a ground zero job. But my resume is too big to even show it to some places. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But, I mean, having been a performer and, oh, yeah, no, I'm a SAG guy. Yeah, no, I've done a ton of commercials in my life. Oh, yeah, I was a stand-up comedian. Yeah, I used to work all the time at comedy clubs here in town. I've been on Conan O'Brien, Comedy Central, one of the very few white Def Comedy Jam winners. Yeah, Showtime's White Boys in the Hood, which taped like 3 or 4 years ago. You can find it online. But not so funny. I don't feel like doing comedy now. Oh, that? They're doing a mic check. There's no microphones here. The police aren't allowing any amplified projected sound. So it's a communicative effort kind of thing with mic check in order to get more people around to spread whatever that one central person is saying. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much to the civilians for being here. Thank you.
So just while the panel's getting on stage, good evening, everyone. My name is Jayashri Wyatt of the Culture Project, and we have an incredible panel for you tonight. And actually, I'd like to really just offer another round of applause for the civilians. That was incredible. And it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion. He is the host of The Majority Report and co-host of Ring of Fire Radio. He appears regularly on MSNBC, CNN, and Current as a political commentator. He has written and directed numerous pilots and films and currently performs recurring voices on Fox's animated series, Bob's Burgers. Please warmly welcome Sam Seder.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I want to introduce your panelists this evening. Patrick Markee is the Senior Policy Analyst and Director of the Advocacy Department at the Coalition for the Homeless. He has authored numerous research studies on affordable housing and homeless policies in New York City, and articles and reviews for The Nation and the New York Times Book Review. Welcome, Patrick. Taylor Jo Isenberg serves as the National Director of the Roosevelt Institute Campus Network, a student policy organization with over 10,000 members. She previously worked for the Partnership for a Secure America as a Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow Carolina for cabaret, and the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. And to my right, Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and columnist for Truthdig, specializing in American and Middle Eastern politics. He was foreign correspondent for the New York Times for 15 years. Join him in the lobby after this conversation, where he'll be signing copies of his new book that he wrote with graphic artist and journalist Jo Isenberg, entitled Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. That'll be right out here in the lobby. Chris Hedges. And Robert Johnson is Executive Director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and Director of the Global Finance Project at the Roosevelt Institute. He regularly contributes to New Deal 2.0 with his Financier column, and serves on the United Nations Commission of Experts on Finance and International Monetary Reform. Okay, so what we'll be doing is we'll do a series of questions, and then we'll be asking for questions from you, and you should hopefully have little cards and writing utensils, and those questions will be collected in the next round of our panel. But Patrick, I want to start with you. You wrote an article entitled, for The Nation magazine, entitled The Unfathomable Cuts in Housing Aid. I want to start sort of on a fairly granular level here. Give us a picture of what's happening in the wake, in particular, of the mortgage crisis in this country, in terms of what you're noticing in terms of housing and homelessness.
Well, it should come as no surprise to anybody that since the economic crisis began in 2008, we've seen a dramatic increase in homelessness in the United States. Even before the economic crisis, there was an estimated more than 3.5 million people who experienced homelessness each year in this country, with nearly 1.5 million of them being children. Here in New York City, for instance, we have 44,000 people bedding down in our shelter system each night, including 18,000 children. And over the course of a year, more than 110,000 different individuals cycle through our emergency shelter system. We're talking about a problem that, you know, for many people when they first encountered it in the 80s, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, you know, seemed like a sort of shocking new feature of the urban landscape, something you couldn't imagine happening in a country as wealthy as ours. 30 years later, it's now an institutionalized part of American life, and we have, you know, a generation or two of Americans who've grown up in a country where mass homelessness is a common feature of American life, where the fact that you've got thousands and thousands of children bedding down in shelters each night, or sleeping in cars, or sleeping doubled up in other poor families' apartments is just a sort of fact of life. I think it was interesting when listening to the talk about Occupy, and I do think one of the interesting things about the Occupy movement was that it amplified a discourse that we had been seeing about income inequality and all these things that had emerged over the same period of time, all the same things that happened in the dramatic structural economic changes that we saw since the 70s and since the Reagan era, in some ways are typified by homelessness. Adding into that, of course, the foreclosure crisis and its kind of intimate sort of relationship with that financial crisis that triggered the lesser depression that we're still living now, and you see, you know, sort of a wave of displacement that's affected, you know, just untold people in this country, and it still remains sadly sort of invisible. You know, when we talk about homelessness, I still think there's that stereotype that most people have, that you're talking about sort of older or middle-aged men holding a paper cup, you know, panhandling on the subway or on the street corner, when in fact the majority of homeless people in New York City now, 3 out of 4 of them are families with kids. And that's more and more the real picture of who experiences homelessness in this country. African American children, Latino children, their families, that's who really is homeless.
And Taylor, give me a sense, I mean, you work obviously with student activists. To what extent are students and young people, I guess, suffering under obviously massive student debt and by the systemic problems that may have arisen out of the crisis, or maybe had existed then? And just give me a sense of what you're hearing from the people that you work with.
Yeah, so to give you a sense of who that audience is, we are a campus-based organization. So our 100 chapters are on different campuses across the country, both community colleges, four-year institutions, Ivies, non-traditional students across the board. I think most people have heard that this generation is the first one that's going to be worse off than its parents, which is huge in the land of opportunity and says a lot about where we are as a country. The average person coming out of college has over $12,500 in debt, credit card debt, over $25,000 in student loans. The student loan bubble is, an aggregate, is going to be over $1 trillion. It is the next big bubble that we are facing as a country and dramatically affecting the opportunities of this generation. And not only do they have all this debt, over 50% of young people are unemployed or underemployed, where they have a four-year degree and are in a position or a job that's minimum wage, that doesn't actually need the education they spent 4 years investing in. So these are issues that are dramatically affecting young people, both in the immediacy right now and then also the long term. This generation, as the largest generation in this country, will be 1/3 of the voting electorate by 2020. So it's a powerful voice. And the decisions that we're making today will dramatically affect the future that we will inherit. And so I think the important thing to mention is that these voices are being represented, these issues are being talked about, because how these young people's issues are addressed is going to dramatically affect the future and direction of the country.
And Rob, Patrick sort of touched on this a little bit, but to what extent did the crisis in 2008, to what extent did it wreck the economy or simply put the sort of a systemic problem, a structural problem in relief? So the Great Recession that we're suffering now, is this simply a function of that crisis, or is it a culmination and the crisis was either the culmination or simply made us sort of brought it home a little quicker?
It certainly was an unmasking of a great deal of things that were unsavory in the economy. We had seen the migration within, say, the corporate sector of fewer and fewer people making more money and becoming financially motivated, playing games with stock buybacks and what have you, rather than playing what you might call R&D and other things to make the corporation productive. We saw, unmasked by the crisis, which created acute violence. A lot of people were living with access to consumer credit. Small businesses were using credit cards for their working capital. One of the most egregious things that happened was that banks were allowed on your existing balances to jack your interest rate up from, say, 6.5% or 7% to 31%. Now, if you came to me and said, do you want a 31% loan when essentially there's no inflation? I'd say, are you out of your mind? You could, but I could walk away from those bad terms. They took lots of people and businesses and retroactively essentially threw them into a downward spiral. And what I think, we can go on and on about all the things that were unmasked, the non-supervision, non-regulation of Wall Street. But what was really unmasked that's very hard for the American people to digest is the disintegration of trust. The mythologies of unfettered free markets were shown to be untrue. But the bailouts, the bonuses, allowing usurious interest rates, not taking things out from the government-protected umbrella, like derivative securities and proprietary trading, allowed the casino to continue so they could have the same problem again. The Dodd-Frank bill didn't really address any of these things. And finally, kind of like to sort of kick you when you're down, everybody's got these mortgage overhangs. You probably all read about Stockton, California and San Bernardino in the last few days. These places are underwater and we're not doing anything about it. Why is that? Because the large banks have home equity lines of credit and second mortgages that they would have to write down to zero if you reschedule the first mortgage. The situation is still very fragile. They don't want to admit how fragile they are, but probably in a little more pernicious light, the big bankers want to pretend they have earnings so they can have a real bonus pool and suck more money out of these institutions rather than fortifying the institutions and acknowledging reality and allowing these communities to move on and forward. But the thing that we're left with is this legacy that we have no capacity to trust in government. So people don't trust experts. If you saw Inside Job, you understand why. People do not trust the private markets, and they don't trust government. In 1997, Bob Dylan wrote a song in his record Time Out of Mind called It's Not Dark Yet, but It's Getting There. Well, now it's dark.
And so I want to come back, obviously, to some of that and talk also about sort of that issue of accountability. And but Chris, first let me come to you. You have a new book out, like I had mentioned, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which again you'll be signing out in the lobby. In it, you describe what you call sacrifice zones. Tell us a little bit about sacrifice zones, and to the extent, again, in that almost a similar question that I asked Rob, to the extent that they were there and the factors that were creating these zones were heightened or simply unmasked by the financial crisis.
Well, these are areas of the country that have been sacrificed so the rest of the country could engage in a level of consumption that were denied to people within these zones. The book is something I did with the graphic illustrator Joe Sacco, and partly because one of the goals of the book was to make these people and these sacrifice zones visible because the wider society has rendered them invisible. But we begin in Pine Ridge, where the whole sort of demented project of unlimited exploitation and subjugation began against native peoples, driven by the railroad magnates, the gold speculators, the timber merchants, and of course backed by the U.S. military. We were different from Europe in that we colonized ourselves, and once we finished with westward expansion, we turned on the Philippines and Cuba and everywhere else, including, of course, today Iraq and Afghanistan. It is about uncovering an ethic where you disempower people within these zones and they are made to prostrate themselves before the dictates of the marketplace. This ideology that we have accepted prima facie, within the wider culture, that somehow the dictates of the marketplace, that human behavior should be made to subjugate itself before the dictates of the marketplace, which is, first of all, a utopian vision. And I use the word utopia the way Thomas More meant it to be used. Utopia literally means no place. It doesn't exist. There's nothing in 3,000 years of economic history to justify the absurdity that human societies should conform to the dictates of the marketplace. We were in Camden, New Jersey. We went right to the bottom because we wanted to show what these unfettered, unregulated, unimpeded forces of corporate capitalism do to communities, do to the environment. We were in southern West Virginia, due to human beings, due to community. Because now that all of those impediments have been lifted, now that we have undergone, as John Ralston Saul says, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over, they've won, they will harvest what's left. And they are harvesting what's left. They're harvesting, again, as Rob touched on, their own structures for personal enrichment. They're harvesting the country. Anytime you have hedge fund managers go into the inner city and talk about education, it's not because they want poor people to learn how to read and write. It's because the federal government spends about $600 billion on education, and they want it. And they're going to get it, just like they're going to get everything else. And I think that the goal of this book was to begin to uncover or unmask the structures of power, corporate power, and how there is nothing now within the formal systems of governance to impede this power. Essentially, we have unleashed corporate systems that commodify everything. Human beings are commodities. The natural world is a commodity that it will exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. In theological terms, and I come out of seminary, these are systems of death. And we have very, very little time left. just in terms of climate change. You may have seen the infrared maps of Greenland that just came out yesterday. It's utterly horrifying. And the fossil fuel industry, when you understand the nature of unfettered or unregulated capitalism, will literally kill the ecosystem on which we depend for life for quarterly profit. They know no limits. There is no capacity within the engine of corporate capitalism itself to place limits. And because we have essentially allowed through systems, the political process, to surrender our power to these corporations, because the judiciary is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state, because systems of information have been corporatized, roughly a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, control almost everything Americans see or listen to or watch. We've been rendered deaf, dumb, and blind. The real dialogue, which of course Occupy captured, is shut out from national discourse. And instead we're debating, we talk about Ann Romney's horse or Newt Gingrich's moon colonies or whether Barack Obama's a socialist. It's out of an Alfred Jarry play. And it's terrifying. And I'll just close by saying that for me, the power of the Occupy movement was that it, number one, understood where power was, which is Wall Street, and secondly, it understood that the only mechanism we have left by which we can save ourselves are acts of civil disobedience.
I want to say good night, everybody. Well, Rob, so let me put it to you, and then I want to come to you guys as well and jump in here, because do you feel, and do you guys feel who are working in advocacy, do you feel that the corporate coup d'etat is, we are on the other side of that, and there is no other coup d'etat to take place, at least through reform, as it were. Are we on the other side of that? And I mean, obviously that's one of the reasons why there's no accountability on some level. Is there no accountability to be had?
I think we'll call it the oligarchy now, is audacious. They don't really care if they're legitimate. There was a time, I always hear Jürgen Habermas was paraphrased by saying, legitimate if you can, coerce if you have to, and accommodate if you must. And I think we've gone past, I almost started, this was really eerie because we didn't compare notes, I almost started my discussion about John Ralston Saul's book, The Unconscious Civilization. And I think we've gone beyond. I'm grateful. We have gone beyond the unconscious civilization. A lot of people don't buy the package anymore that's emanating from those corporations you talked about. But there is a sort of, okay guys, you're mad. How are you going to stop me mentality at the top. Now I'm going to say that fight has to happen. But there's also, they always talk about Marx and capitalism, capitalists versus labor. A lot of the interesting fissures in a system are intra-capitalist conflict. And right now, I guess the way I'd put it in a metaphor is it feels like there are an awful lot of the elite that know this system is not wholesome. And they're all standing on the deck of the Titanic looking in each other's eyes. And they're asking a question with their eyes. Are we going to help this navigator? Are we going to help this captain get off the ice? Are we going to get the food and the jewels from the safe and put them in our lifeboat? And my sense is that most of them are trying to get stuff into their lifeboat. And that system isn't going to cohere. And in that dysfunction, there is opportunity.
Yeah. And I think Chris Hayes talks about the fractal inequality, and that's in his Twilight of the Elites, and that's sort of some of the I guess are we simply Taylor? Are we simply waiting for some of those people on the deck to decide?
The millennials.
Well, yes, I mean, are students? Do they have this level of consciousness? I mean, do they realize there's something fundamentally different than perhaps when their parents were students?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think across the board, well, first of all, I just want to say that I'm extremely humbled and slightly intimidated by the fact that I'm the only person on the stage who's not cool enough to have my own Wikipedia page. But anyway, yeah, no, I think it's huge. I think when you look at the numbers, there's all kinds of research. People are fascinated with millennials, how they articulate and exercise their political beliefs, particularly after 2008, where you saw this mass mobilization. This generation by far is significantly more progressive than the ones before it. That's both in the numbers, it's very much so on social issues and to a lesser degree on economic issues and domestic issues. I think that what you saw with Occupy was that awareness. I think that the numbers, over 70% of millennials identify with the values that Occupy espoused. I think it's an interesting question of whether they believed in the tactics and also followed the tactics in full. I think it goes back to the fact that Occupy overall was actually a little bit of an older cohort than not just millennials. So I think that the recognition is there. I mean, they are angry at Wall Street. They are angry at government. There's this really we see it among our network. Students aren't interested in just talking about how we need to tweak this policy to make it better. They're talking about how can we change the system to make sure the policies that we really care about can get us to the kind of the future that we want to inherit. So the awareness is there. I think there's a little bit of confusion about how we get there. I think that's the piece that millennials are action-oriented, and I think that when they espouse the values of Occupy, I think the next step that they're trying to see is like, okay, how do we actualize this? How do we make this happen? And that is a huge question. But I think that the awareness, absolutely, among this generation that is going to drive this process over the long term is there. It's the question of whether we can maintain that.
Patrick, are you finding amongst the homeless, and when we talk about homeless or not, that sort of the stereotypical middle-aged man, but families, is there time, I mean, just in capacity for people who are sort of are a daily struggle to survive? Is there time and capacity to take these perspectives and to act upon them?
I mean, yes. I mean, you know, it's different for different folks depending on their kind of the level of crisis that they're in. I mean, I guess I would say it's interesting. A colleague of mine talks about the other 1%. I mean, if we have 3.5 million Americans who experience homelessness each year, that's the 1% whose voices, you know, need to be a part of that dialogue. And we saw lots of homeless and formerly homeless folks who are participating actively, you know, down at Liberty Plaza, around the country and other parts of the Occupy movements and other occupations. A colleague of mine in DC talked movingly about a homeless vet who stood up at one of the Occupy kind of actions there and talked movingly about how he didn't want it just to be about homeless veterans, which is what the Obama administration is sort of focusing on now. He wanted every homeless person to follow along, to be brought along. But it's interesting, I'm thinking about what Chris said too about these sort of zones of sacrifice. I mean, I think what we've seen in homelessness, you know, this mass homelessness of the last 30 years, which is a fairly unique phenomenon in American history, if you think about it. I mean, the last period of mass homelessness that we had in the United States history was during the Great Depression, and look what came out of that. Not only the New Deal, but public housing and all of the housing reform movements and all the activism that came out of that. What we've seen in these last 30 years are people who've been sacrificed, you know, a whole class of, you know, surplus labor, of kind of marginalized poor people who have been literally shunted to the side and institutionalized in the real sense of the word of we're putting folks in shelters. And then, of course, there's the institutionalization of jails and prisons. And we're taking that kind of segment of the population that's been written off by corporate capital and saying we're moving them to the margins and just putting them aside. So it's not just communities. I mean, we have zones of sacrifice right here in New York City. We have whole neighborhoods and, you know, and thousands of people, you know, every night who are sacrificed to that sort of corporate movement.
Chris, when you hear Taylor talk about the millennials and They're socially progressive. I mean, is this enough? I mean, are we at the point now where there's such systemic corruption and lack of accountability that we're beyond the efficacy of advocating for, in sort of like the classical political sphere, for policies? I mean, are we just sort of, I guess, nibbling at the edges here?
Well, I mean, first let's address the issue of social issues, which Bloomberg is basically okay on. And yet he is a creation of Wall Street and an enemy of the Occupy movement. So I think part of the problem is that too many people within the liberal class or on the left focus too much of their energy into boutique activism, inclusiveness, diversity, all of which I support, of course. But they forgot about the primacy of justice. And while they forgot about the primacy of justice, the corporate state was making war against the working class and has destroyed the working class in this country. There's been a Weimarization of the American working class, and now we are seeing an assault on the middle class as we reconfigure the country and the global economy into a form of neo-feudalism, a world that replicates the power structure of George Orwell's 1984, where you have an inner party of 3 to 4%, an outer party of about 12 to 14%. These are corporate managers, public relations, and then the rest of us become proles, hanging on by our fingertips. And I think this is, for me, one of the great failures of the liberal class, and I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which is over 200 pages looking at this. And it coughed up, for me, these extremely repugnant figures like Bill Clinton, who spoke in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism while assiduously carrying out the dictates of corporate power. It was under the Clinton administration that we saw welfare destroyed. And remember that 70% of the recipients of welfare were children. It was under Clinton that we passed NAFTA, which was the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it extremely difficult to organize. And serious structural analysis of power and how it works is utterly absent from the mainstream. And I feel it every time. I just came back from France. I had a book published in France. And, I get Le Monde, I'm on Radio France, I'm on, Entendu, I go to Canada, it's the CBC here. That kind of analysis which Saul makes, and the Canadians are more open to it, of course. Naomi Klein does it, Adbusters does it, Marshall McLuhan did it. That's just utterly wiped out from within the discussion. And I think that at this point, especially after Citizens United, which for me was the death knell of America, at that point it was over for me. American democracy was extremely anemic. But there's no way to compete. And the perfect sort of case study of this is Wisconsin, where they could have gone one of two ways. They could have gone towards a general strike. Sadly, they got pushed by the AFL-CIO and the Democratic Party back into a recall. And we can't fight anymore on those grounds. They should have gone for the general strike. I'll just close by saying that all the correctives to American democracy came through movements that never achieved formal positions of power. Whether it was the Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists that fought for women's rights, the labor movement, or the civil rights movement. And yet you could argue, at least until he was assassinated in April of 1968, that the most powerful political figure in the country was Martin Luther King, because when he went to Selma, 50,000 people went with him. And I think for me, the problem of the left is that we forgot it's not our job to take power. Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies writes that the question, how do you get good people to rule, is the wrong question. Most people attracted to power, Popper says, are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do you get the people in power to be frightened of you? I lived in France. Sarkozy was a cretin, but he was terrified of the unions and the student unions. I mean, I told my son, who just graduated from Colgate, if you went to France and told French students that they had to pay $52,000 a year to go to college, they'd shut the damn country down. There's a wonderful scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where it's 1971, you know, and Nixon was the last liberal president we had. Not because he was a liberal, but because he was scared of movements. And he and Henry are standing by the window of the White House, and they've got thousands of anti-war demonstrators, and Nixon's terrified, and he's surrounded the entire White House end to end with empty buses, and he looks out the window and he says, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where we want people in power to be.
Rob, and this is a question for all of you, I guess, though. I mean, can we get to that point? Because it was also, not coincidentally, those students could have ended up going to Vietnam. They had, there was an incredible amount of stakes for them that were very explicit. Tuesday, I could be gone. And on top of that, we had come through a period which Krugman calls the Great Compression, where there was at least a sense of financial security. That if I go out and get arrested, so what? I'll go get my job from IBM or whatever it is, and I'll be there for 30 years. That's just the way it works. That doesn't exist today. Rob, I want to hear, and then from you both, if we can have a movement where people are willing to get that angry and deal, particularly when we see what happened in New York City. You know, we had cops, you know, knocking on people's doors. We saw the presentation of it here. Is there room for that? I mean, how bad does it have to get? And, you know.
Well, you're asking a lot of interesting questions. One of the things that I
2
saw.
minutes to.
I got you. I got you. When I went down to Zuccotti Park, one of the things that I noticed was how conflicted the police were. Early on, when they were talking to New York teachers, they saw themselves as next in line in terms of the cuts, and they were very conflicted when things would rise up about what role they should play. The students in Zuccotti Park were fascinating. And even in that respect, my son is fascinating. They were actually relieved that we were taking away this carcass of this conforming to this ideology, the unconscious civilization that John Ralston talked about. They were relieved they didn't have to keep playing that game or playing those codes. And so, but at the same time, and I think definitely the liberal class had a lot to say about this, people want to feel good. And when they can't, like a football running back, they can't see any daylight upfield, they sometimes buy false resolution just to alleviate their anxiety. So it has to get deeper, and it has to get more painful. But when Bill Grider, who I think is one of those prophetic witnesses of our society, was writing his book called Who Will Tell the People, he called me and he said, Rob, what's the magic bullet? And I'd read the whole manuscript. I said, Bill, it's outrage. It's action. It's rebellion. He said, that's right. But the question is, when do we get to that point? We got a taste of it with Occupy. But that is where we have to go. And we have a lot of smart people in this room that want to get that Titanic off the ice. And that's what we have to do.
Students today, are they in any way constricted by the sort of insecurity that they have about the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that we get a lot, so the way Roosevelt is organized is we are a grassroots organization. So my job as national director is beholden to the students, which means that their ideas and what they're passionate about and what they're working on is what we elevate as an organization. We get a lot of questions sometimes of like, why don't we see more of what we saw in the 60s and 70s, like that kind of activism. And I don't have an answer to that. I think that, yes, some of the insecurity that we have, and I think this goes back to actually what the Roosevelt Institute really talks a lot about, that there has been for the last 20, 30 years this narrative that has defined the way that we interact with the system. And it's very difficult to move beyond that narrative when that's all you've ever known. And this generation, born in the late 80s or mid 80s and the 90s now, that's what we know. And I think so it's difficult sometimes, I think, for millennials and for young people to think, what is the alternative? And I think that's what Occupy really did. The fact that you went from a news cycle that solely focused on debt and deficit into one that talked about equality, that's what Occupy did. I think when it gets back to whether the insecurity that they're feeling filters into like whether the rage will get there, I wish I had an answer to that. I think that student debt, I mean, is an easy thing to focus on because it's something that directly impacts what young people are directly feeling in that moment. But I think what's also very unique is this is a really empathetic generation because you see this massive interest in what's happening with climate change. Like there's this massive interest in like thinking about how your actions as an individual here in the United States affects the person living over in Africa, which is something that I think at the end of the day is going to be the key formula of can we get back this sense of community spirit and then recognize that that's going to take the combination of the community spirit and a lot of pissed off people to make something happen. But in terms of an answer of like what that exactly looks like, I don't know.
Patrick, before we take the questions from the audience, I'm curious, I mean, do you see that any change in sort of the radicalization with the people that you work with? Because on some level, they don't, it doesn't get much worse at that point. But
yeah, I mean, it's I think for the folks we're working with, it oscillates between outrage, and this is a group of folks who've been, as I said, I think who've been so sacrificed by all of the sort of structural and sort of economic and political changes of the last 30 years. These are the folks that have been marginalized. They know what's happened. I mean, they know inchoately what's happened, and so there's outrage, but it's they're living lives in crisis. Right. Their survival is literally at question every day. And what I think was actually interesting about Occupy, and it's a question that hasn't been answered yet, and it's is the alliances that started to be made between the activists that were there and community organizing groups. I mean, here in New York we saw that where there was a lot of sort of synergy, and this continues between community organizing groups and groups there. Like, so folks that were really working in the community, doing tenant organizing, doing, labor organizing on the very local level at the local market or whatever, and then labor. And I think that's an organized labor, and I think that's that the test is going to be sort of where that goes. And it's what actually got the folks that we were working with, homeless and formerly homeless people, and in other states and communities as well, it got them interested as well, as that idea of like maybe the discourse that Occupy is kind of highlighting and amplifying about income inequality, about the 99% and that 1% is exactly what we've seen and exactly what we're living. But I think how you translate that outrage into pushing for more change. And I will just also say too, and I say this as someone who works for a group that is part of that sort of social services left, the kind of the groups that when they recognized the failure of government, beginning in the 60s and 70s, stepped in and started doing the work that government ought to have been doing in communities, community-based groups. I think there's also needs to be a recognition by the kind of nonprofit world and the NGOs and all of that they need to play a different role too, and it needs to be an activist role instead of the role that sort of just has them, doing the work that government ought to have been doing in the first place. We should be making government do that.
Sure, please.
I covered 20 years overseas, a variety of movements and revolutions and insurrections from Latin America to the Middle East to most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. And it's always the ruling elite that determines the parameters of rebellion. When Conrad Black wrote his biography of Roosevelt, he said that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. The New Deal functioned the way liberal institutions are supposed to function in a democratic capitalist society, as a kind of safety valve. It makes incremental and piecemeal reform possible. Those institutions have been destroyed by corporate capitalism in their myopia, because ultimately they in essence have destroyed not only their own legitimacy, but ultimately their own viability. And in all of the movements that I covered, you never know what triggers it. It's usually something incredibly banal. But the fact that the state decided to respond to the Occupy movement not by instituting minimal reforms, such as a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, or a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, or a forgiveness of student debt, or the public option, which Obama and the insurance companies killed for us. The fact that the only message that it delivered was the message of force means that they have determined that rebellion is not going to go away. And these, if you watch the trajectory of any movement, it doesn't move in a kind of linear progression upwards. Even the civil rights movement, you know, great failures in Albany, Mississippi, and everywhere else. King trying to hold this fractured, group together. What has been unleashed, I think, can't be stopped. And just as 1905 was the dress rehearsal in Petrograd for 1917, just as the Stamp Act Rebellion in 1765 was the dress rehearsal for 1776, that moment when the federal authorities stepped in a concerted and organized effort to wipe out these encampments, for me, delivered the message. And that is that we have unleashed forces within this society that will confront these corporate systems of power. But what will spark it? It may be just an elderly woman in Utah being pushed out of her home. It will be something that seemingly insignificant that will tip people over the edge. And that's certainly what I saw in all of the movements that I covered. And let me just finally conclude by saying that the importance, and I've been down in Zuccotti, I was down there a few weeks ago with Father Daniel Berrigan, 92 years old. You know, the importance of continuing acts of resistance is that it keeps this narrative alive. When I was in Prague, I covered the Velvet Revolution in Prague. There were, through all the streets of the city, posters of a Charles University student named Jan Panic, who, to protest the Soviet invasion of Prague and the overthrow of Dubček in '68, had gone to Wenceslas Square, lit himself on fire, died 4 days later of his burns. Thousands of students marched with his body to the cemetery. It was broken up by the police. It was not reported on the state media. When his grave became a shrine, the communist authorities dug up his remains, cremated them, gave the ashes to his mother, and said that she was not allowed to rebury them. And his presence in the city that November and December was palpable. 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people crowded into Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Panic Square. I was also there, 500,000 people, Wenceslas Square, snowing on a December night, when Marta Kubashaya, who had been, before 1968, the best-known singer in Czechoslovakia, and when the tanks rolled into the city, sung the anthem of defiance, broadcast over the radio. Once the pro-Soviet government was back in place, not only did she become a non-person, but they destroyed her entire recording stock, and she was not allowed to appear on the airwaves. From that moment until the Velvet Revolution, she had worked on an assembly line at a toy factory. And she walked out that night and sang that anthem, and everyone in that crowd knew every word. The power of resistance, as Havel says in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, is that we speak a fundamental truth about this system that terrifies them.
Okay, we don't have the questions yet, but well, all right, somebody will come around and collect it. Well, I want to pick up with this, Rob, because I want to ask you if the failure of Obama, ostensibly the liberal here who's going to let the air out of the tires to save capitalism. The failure for Obama to seek any accountability from the bankers, to unwind the crisis in a way that would have helped people in their homes first, as opposed to helping the banks and hoping that they would do the right thing. Does that create more of the context for this type of realization amongst Americans, as opposed to, say, you know, those Republicans is what they do. We just need to get a liberal into office.
Chris Hedges, in his book, Twilight of the Elites, he and I talked about it a lot. And he says in the opening pages that I'm a traitor to my class, because I was a hedge fund manager and how I say, qualified for the 1%. And I said to him, you got that wrong. I think these people are going to destroy themselves. And that inability, like Roosevelt, of them to conserve the system, when, as Chris talked about, they didn't do any policies that were accommodative, they used coercion, they lead me back to an awareness of when I was sitting in Zuccotti Park talking to a young man one night, and I asked him, I said, are you scared? He said, yeah. And I said, well, why are you here? He said, because I'm more scared not to do this. And everything that's been done to help the banks and not the people, to use force and not accommodate on mortgages or food or student loans, fortifies that resolve, that I'm more scared not to protest. So this isn't going to end until something changes. And these people are pouring gasoline on the flames. And maybe there's a hubris where they think they can use coercion and everybody will end up going home and going away. But I actually think there's a tradition in this country over a couple hundred years that's going to be hard to wring out of everyone's mind and heart. So that they are not playing a coherent endgame.
Do we have those questions? Or? Okay, well, well, I'll ask, Patrick, you mentioned the unions. Where are the unions? Are they revolting or are they giving in?
I'm sorry,
Are they revolting or giving in?
I mean, I don't even know if I'm qualified to answer that, but I think the bigger issue is really like, what percentage of the workforce in this country is actually unionized now? 12%, and less than that of the private workforce? I mean, I think at this point, that's the bigger over decades kind of tidal change that we've seen, and speaks very much to these major structural changes we've seen, the stagnation of wages and incomes over the last 30 years, along with the explosion of wealth and income at the top 1% and 0.1%. I mean, that structural change, I think, speaks to that. I think the question is going to be when organized labor is ready to go and organize what's really the working class in this country, the retail workers, home health aides, like all these folks that are, what's left. It's not the manufacturing workers anymore. It's not public sector workers alone anymore. It's what's left of the working class in this country.
Do either one of you think there's any capacity for unions to, I mean, it seems that they function on a very narrow playing field, that they're not necessarily representing labor as much as they are unions?
Well, first of all, they're a spent force. I mean, you only have 4% of the American workforce is in manufacturing. Only 12% of the labor force in the country is unionized. Most of that is in public sector unions. I think we were just talking, it's only 4% that are not in public sector unions. And of course, what we're seeing, especially with the recent Supreme Court decision, is an assault to destroy public sector unions. I live in the state of New Jersey, and this is Chris Christie's great crusade against police unions. And you're right, the cops are next. It's against teachers unions. And the problem is that, and this goes back to the destruction of the radical and progressive movements that began in World War I. So that by the time you see the rise of the New Left in the 1960s, you have the AFL-CIO supporting Nixon's war in Indochina and denouncing the hippies in the street. It used to be that if you went to the coal fields of southern West Virginia, the hero was Mother Jones. Now it's Michelle Bachmann. And the reason is because labor essentially, as you point out, Sam, essentially became a kind of junior partner in the corporate state. They protected their own, and of course now, what they're doing is making more and more concessions. I mean, for instance, new workers who come into the workforce are not going to be protected so that the old workers can be. They're shriveling up and dying.
They're going down below decks, getting their jewels.
And this is very frightening because most social movements throughout history have counted on the backbone of labor. But we don't have it. That has been taken away from the equation, which makes it much more difficult. And I'll just conclude by saying, let's not forget that this can go the wrong way. Just as in Europe in the 1930s, it went the wrong way. Right-wing populism, and we see it in the Tea Party, we see it in the Christian right, which is proto-fascist. It celebrates the gun culture. It celebrates the language of violence. It does what fascist movements do, which is funnel a legitimate rage and a legitimate sense of betrayal against the vulnerable, against the poor, against undocumented workers, against Muslims, against homosexuals, against feminists, intellectuals. They got a very long list of hate. And they are bankrolled by the most retrograde forces in American society, the Koch brothers and others. And the longer you have political paralysis, which is essentially what has happened, the more you empower these extremes. And there is a very dark undercurrent of violence in this country. And we cannot exclude the fact that these forces may be given life. I spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to him. And I come out of seminary, and these are quintessentially fascist movements in every sense of the word. And they are very powerful, and they have severed tens of millions of Americans from the mainstream. Everything they see is reflected through the lens of this very dark and perverted ideology. So I think that the breaking of labor, which was quite conscious on the part of the capitalist corporate class, is something that has severely weakened us, because you go into towns like Ohio, and instead of a labor hall being the center of activity, it's a megachurch.
And Rob, do you want to add?
I just would add a reference. The management theorist Peter Drucker, first book, which he couldn't get published for 7 or 8 years, was called The End of Economic Man. And it was a discussion of Germany and how principles and all aspects of humanity were eventually forfeited in despair to restore order. And when you read that book, which has been reprinted in recent years, you can buy it on Amazon or get it at the Strand or what have you. Yeah, well, I don't. Yeah, you get them to order for you. But the idea that's contained in that dysfunction and how it's resolved resonates with the feeling you have as you drive around the United States right now. Probably some of the towns that you studied in your most recent book.
Sorry, can I add something real quick on that as well? Just, because I think it's an interesting question, because I think the underlying part about unions is just political infrastructure in general. Young people aren't unionizing, and I think that the question is, what is the next iteration of political infrastructure that people can plug into to be able to build the movements that we need? I don't think that question's been answered, and I think both unions and then people who aren't in unions need to think about what that looks like. That's a driving idea behind the Campus Network and Pipeline, which is our network for young workers and young professionals, is that the political infrastructure is not there anymore, and whether it's in unions or whatever comes next, it's going to be critical for moving a lot of these things forward.
Sam, let me just add one other thing. Just this past week, Dick Ravitch and Paul Volcker put out a report on state and municipal finances and the crisis that they're in. Underpinning all of this is, as you mentioned, the churches are organizing on the right. It's these municipal governments and their unions and their employees that are essentially the network of the progressive side in this country. And the constriction of federal finances, when 1 out of every $3 in a state or municipal government is a transfer from the federal government, the constriction at the federal level has put all of these places in crisis. You're reading about it in California right now. The dismantling of another layer of progressive resistance and infrastructure, teachers and firemen and police and whatever, is really, what you might call, going to intensify this darkness and this loss of backbone.
And we've already lost 600,000 plus jobs in the past 3 years of basically state municipal workers, which is not only is significantly below where we've been at any other recession, regardless who was, and not just in terms of losses, but this time in the Bush administration and the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration following the recession, we were up 300, 600,000, in some cases even more in terms of those.
Decompose job growth and loss across recessions. That is the big difference.
That's the big drag on the economy on some level. It's the austerity that's happening, as well as the tremendous amount of wealth that's been destroyed.
But this goes back to your earlier question. Did the 2008 crisis unmask, or did it, is it just an intensification? And we saw that 30 years before the financialization of capital, everything that happened during that period to create the bubble and the crisis. But we've also seen corporate capital now looking for profiteering in the public sector in a way that it hadn't before. I mean, the privatization of prisons, the privatization of the social services sector that I talked about. Now the hedge funds attacking public school teacher unions and
Peter
making money off the public
school. Peter Orszag had a piece
school.
today in the Times saying that we should privatize the post office, in one of the most egregious op-eds I think I've read since Tom Friedman wrote his last op-ed.
I want to interject one question for the audience to consider. We have a Federal Reserve, our central bank, which makes zero interest loans to banks. They also do things, as Matt Taibbi's pointed out, like give loans to the wives of Wall Street executives to go out and buy mortgage securities and make a windfall. But they are not extending credit to places like California, Illinois, New York, so that those services must be cut off. And we have this ethic in the market mantra that we don't pick winners. Right now, our central bank is picking winners and losers, and that's something that deserves a heck of a lot of scrutiny.
I think we have time for one more, and this, I guess, well, I'll read the question, but isn't the fault line for change likely when the price of oil truly goes through the roof and all the rest of the economic activity begins to collapse as a result? So I guess the question is, are we primed for another type of financial crisis that is acute? I mean, we're going through one now that is sort of a slow, if not slow, like immediately medium rapid boil, I guess. But are we just closer to the point of another massive type of economic crisis from any number of factors than we are to people just saying, oh my God, I realize now we're getting totally screwed? Sure.
I think we're in an extremely precarious and vulnerable condition, which the unmasking of these years has revealed. It's been there, it's been growing on people for a long time, but not, this is really fascinating. I sit on the board of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, and they do a wonderful document called The State of Working America. And they have been writing and screaming about increasing inequality probably since about 1983. And it took Occupy to get the press to recognize these facts that had been building for 30 years. And so I guess what I would say is you get a spike in oil and it causes dysfunction. And it's just a further unmasking of how incoherent things are when you think of all the time in which we could have prepared with taxes or subsidization of alternative energy. I mean, economists are a little wired funny because they think if something has a zero price, it has no value. Try turning off the water or the oxygen. They'll pay you a lot to turn it back on. And we're in a system right now which dependence on markets isn't producing results that sustain this planet. And an oil spike can tip over what you might call the old way of doing things. But we really need a threshold change. And I think the crisis is there whether oil goes up or not.
Okay, I mean, I think we have time, just if there's any final comments that you guys want to add at all.
For the inexperienced person first.
Rob? Okay.
I am sure, no matter how hard I try, I am only the second best Robert Johnson to tell you you're at a crossroads. And yet, I often think about what gives life meaning. And I think the crisis is evident within all your spirits and throughout the nation and throughout the world. And at some level, I often recite Cornel West's book on Democracy Matters, where he said there are three things you gotta have. You have to have prophetic witnesses, you have to have the humility to have a Socratic sense of questioning and not act as though you already know. And the third is you have to have a tragicomic sense of a bluesman, of a blues artist. And so I'll stick with my name for that. I think this is a tremendous time of opportunity. And perhaps to illustrate that, I would encourage you to watch Chris Hedges on YouTube and on Bill Moyers over time. Because I perceive, and we just met tonight for the first time, I perceive a focus and a purpose in your spirit, that you realize the time is now. There is meaning now. There is action. There is a way to make a difference. And for an awful lot of years, people who had a prophetic state of mind like yourself probably didn't see that window. So I want to finish. My last thought is to encourage you all to engage now, because I do think you can make a difference. We are at the crossroads.
I mean, I guess I would only say it's, as I said earlier, sometimes it's a little depressing when I'll go to speak to a university audience or high school audience and realize that I'm talking to a group of folks who grew up in the United States where mass homelessness was an everyday feature of urban life. It was something you expected to see. It wasn't surprising to see an absolutely impoverished person standing on your street corner, without a home. And how, and when you think about it, how vital home is. It's the place that you go back to nurture yourself and to kind of revive yourself at the end of every day. It's the place that's sort of the center of your life, and to not have that and what that means to take that away from people. So as I said, it becomes, it can be a depressing reality to think this is a huge, feature of American life that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. At the same time, working with the folks that we work with and seeing what the struggles that they go through every day and just how incredible the resiliency and the kind of will to survive and will to get through is. And then, I take some hope from what we saw in Occupy, just the glimmer of it there, and some of what Chris said earlier about how there's going to be a spark at some point, and the folks that we work with, I think, are absolutely waiting for that spark and waiting to get involved, and are getting involved and are doing activism, on the very local level, fighting for better conditions at the shelter that they're staying at, or fighting for, housing relief to be able to escape the shelter system, but looking also for something, I think, a bigger fight to be a part of.
Taylor?
Yeah, so I think when you look at social movements throughout history, young people have always played a critical part. I think because there's this boldness that you have when you don't have that much to lose. And I think there's also a creativity and a visioning that is allowed because you don't know quite yet what's possible. And I think if we continue to tap into that, there's a lot that this generation has to offer. We've seen it abroad. You've seen it in Egypt. You've seen it in Tunisia. We've seen it start here. And I think the point with this generation is can we make that happen? And so I think that the thing that I would say to the audience members who may not be within the 1983 to 2003 age range is that I'm sure a lot of you guys are organizers, have done organizing work. You have to meet people where they're at. Listen to this generation and what they're saying, because if you can tap into what their passions are, what their concerns are, and then give them a platform to vocalize that as a part of this conversation and inform it with the knowledge that is out there, that is a recipe for success. And so that would be my kind of call to action there, is talk to the people that are in this age range, because they want to listen and then they want to act upon what you guys can do together.
The process that we're undergoing is about the recovery of an ethic. We saw powerful forces of propaganda on Madison Avenue destroy American culture, values of self-effacement, thrift, and replace it with this drive for consumption as a kind of inner compulsion, this cult of the self, this hedonism. And I think that part of the almost unmentioned power of the Occupy movement is that it challenged this corporate belief system, this notion that it's about us. It understood, as Martin Buber did in I and Thou, that in the end it's not ultimately, if we care about a coherent society, us at all. It's about our neighbor. And in biblical terms, we betrayed our neighbors. We betrayed the people of color, African Americans in places like East New York. We betrayed indigenous cultures on Pine Ridge. We betrayed the coal miners in West Virginia, just as we have betrayed undocumented workers. And I look at what's happening as a kind of reawakening of moral values. And understanding that if we want a society that works, we can't abandon our neighbor anymore.
Well, I want to thank all the members of our panel and remind you that Chris will be signing Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt in, I believe, in the lobby there. And thanks for coming out tonight. You guys were great.